And we are currently students at the University of Nevada, Reno, taking business journalism.
Yep.
And it is an absolute honor for us to be able to moderate this panel today, covering Silicon Valley and tech. So thank you to everyone who has signed up and is currently in attendance. We have some great panelists today. So Jacob, take it away.
Yeah. So first we have Amir Afridi, who is the executive editor at The Information. He started The Information in 2013, has won 4 different SABEW awards. Before The Information, he spent 9 years at the Wall Street Journal reporting on tech, health, and criminal justice. He was the first to report on Bernie Madoff's arrest and broke major news on epic frauds. Would you like to add anything else to that, Amir?
No, that sounds good.
Cool. Awesome. And we also have Erin Wu, who is a reporter at The Information as well. We're covering Twitter, startups, and venture capitalist firms. Before she was at The Information, she was reporting the Elizabeth Holmes trial over at the New York Times, and she is a recent graduate at Stanford. And she's currently residing in San Francisco. Sorry. Would you like to add anything else, Amir? Or Erin, sorry.
No, I think that covers it. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Awesome. And then finally, we have Brad Stone, who is the senior executive editor for technology at Bloomberg News and the author of Amazon Unbound. Currently, he heads a team of 50 reporters and editors that cover high-tech companies, startups, and internet trends around the world. Lots of background in tech and tech coverage. So we're very happy to have you. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Brad?
Nope. Thank you, Emerson.
Awesome. So just to get into our topic today, the current landscape of Silicon Valley is quite shaky, as a lot of people have seen in recent news, if you have been reading any of the tech coverage from our lovely panelists. The biggest thing we hope to touch on today is how to spot a scam or know if something is not quite right. Jacob?
Yes. And in recent years, with the Elizabeth Holmes and Sam Bankman-Fried, and now the Silicon Valley Bank situation, we have seen these organizations fall due to incompetence, unorthodox practices. And with all of these recent meltdowns, why and how is digging deeper into these types of organizations and others? Why is it important so that we don't fall victim to these potential scams?
Yeah, if anyone wants to jump on that.
This is open to everyone.
Yeah.
What do you think, guys? Who wants to take first crack at it? I'm happy to.
Yeah, go for it, Brad.
Okay. All right. It's a great question. I've been covering Silicon Valley, not to pull rank on Amir and Erin, but maybe a little bit longer, since the late 90s. And so I've seen the boom, bust, the revival, another bust in 2008, 2009, the long boom, scandals all along the way. I mean, I think the very first thing that you kind of probably learn as you cover Silicon Valley is that it's all a fraud. Everything's fake. At the beginning, it's all hypothetical. When a venture capitalist invests in a startup, invests $300 million in a startup and values it at $1 billion, it's not because the revenue justifies that or the idea, is a slam dunk. It's because they're betting on promise and pedigree. They're making gut bets. Often they're following the pack. And so when you cover, Silicon Valley, you have to bring a sort of inherent skepticism, to every company that you cover. Now, obviously, what we're talking about are like the aberrations, these secret frauds. They're very tough to root out. Theranos was discovered because, in large part because of the work of one Wall Street Journal reporter. Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX was in large part discovered because an arch rival at a company called Binance sort of raised the alarm. I think the inherent skepticism helps a lot. The other real risk is I would call it, sort of non-editorial or quasi-editorial things like Time Magazine's 100 most influential or Forbes 400 richest. That these are the ways in which publications or journals kind of get themselves in trouble by suspending that inherent skepticism I was talking about and elevating these entrepreneurs and founders, not because, your editorial instincts demand it, because it aligns with some sort of broader business goals. And that's when you kind of look back, and there are a lot of publications with egg on their faces, because they've elevated these entrepreneurs, bypassed some of the inherent skepticism, and elevated them maybe beyond what they deserve. I mean, that said, like, it's incredibly hard when an entrepreneur is running a scam, as Sam Bankman-Fried was at FTX, to root it out, unless you're really listening to instinct and pulling on threads, as John Carreyrou was at the Journal. So it's not impossible, but some of these examples are of companies that appear to have everything going for them and to be completely above board, and eventually they do get found out, but it takes an extraordinary set of circumstances. But when you cover this long enough, and you kind of live with the fear that any of these companies or entrepreneurs that you're covering, might be selling a bill of goods, that's the sort of, I think, best approach to go out there in the world with, and be very cautious and skeptical as you talk to these companies.
That's a great way to start, Brad. And I would just say, very specifically on FTX, there was a very clear conflict of interest that had been written about many times. And I think maybe in hindsight, we didn't make as much of it as we should have. But there was a very clear conflict of interest there between two entities, FTX and Alameda, trading firm that, if you read anything about it, we're very tightly linked. And these entrepreneurs and Sam claimed to not have any connection between the two, or that the two were run separately. Obviously, they weren't. So everyone knew this, and it was sort of hiding in plain sight in that sense. We just didn't know how much that conflict of interest was being exploited. But conflicts of interest are very rampant around here. I would say and Aaron can talk very specifically about a kind of, I wouldn't know if we could call it a scam so much as a overhyped company that was able to raise an absurd amount of money based on very little. But there are, certainly in many cases, there's a fake it till you make it approach, and that's a phrase that I think venture capitalists and founders all acknowledge is something that happens. There's a lot of showmanship. A lot of startups are really living on a razor's edge until they make it. But they often do make it, and sometimes make it to a really great extent. And so you also, at the same time that you're very skeptical, and you need to sort of argue the other side of it. Like, what if this succeeds? Because it can succeed, right? Like, I'm sure when Brad was starting, Amazon was considered a risky company that wasn't, doing all that well necessarily.
Still is, by the way.
People were making fun of it. Yeah, but people were making fun of it, right? Ballmer was like, "Oh, they don't make any money," and Brad wrote the kind of seminal book on the formation and the rise of that company. But they obviously did figure some things out, and they created Amazon Web Services that ended up being all right. I think plenty of skepticism around Google as well, and so on. So you do sort of have to look at both sides. I think where I kind of experienced this type of element was around self-driving car development, and there's a lot to say on this, but certainly many companies in that field were completely full of it, and they hoodwinked a lot of people. Now, there are some legitimate efforts underway, and I don't want to pronounce them failures, but there were plenty of charlatans, and were plenty of folks who were absolutely faking, technology, and also lying to their CEOs if they were inside of a bigger company as to what was going on. So it was something where, if you really take the time to understand the technology, try to talk to, none of us here are technical people, but if you talk to enough technical people, you can find the individuals who do the best job of translating engineering to plain English. And maybe ChatGPT will help even more people to do that in the future. But it's something where, if you find these individuals, they can really show you the way. And if you can get really deep on what is actually being developed, you can end up talking to these whistleblowers and other folks who've kind of had it. But I can turn it over to Aaron, who had some very interesting experiences with a particular company. Were they a decacorn? Were they? I forget what.
They were a decacorn. They were valued at $11 billion when I was writing about them.
Yeah, tell us about both.
The company Amir is talking about is Bolt, which was a fintech one-click checkout company that was raised nearly $1 billion from venture capitalists, and at one point was valued at around $11 billion. And this company was only ever did around 30 million in annual revenue, which is around a 360 times. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick today. Around a 360 times revenue multiple, which is insane and much higher than any startup really should be valued. And so the way I was able to write about this company was by talking to just dozens of current and former employees. And that's been one of the most useful things for me to do, both in reporting that story and also in reporting on Twitter, which I'm doing right now. Insiders in many cases will know what's going on. Like they will be able to see through, they'll be able to see through the message that the company is putting out. Oftentimes in the case of salespeople, like they're the ones being given the message to give out, and they're the ones who can like see the delta between what's actually going on, like what the company is being told to say. But also, yeah, like speaking of Theranos, the Elizabeth Holmes trial, one of the first big companies, or one of the first big stories that I covered at the New York Times, like was the Elizabeth Holmes trial, which is just a very singular way to start a career in tech journalism, because you are spending every single day essentially like with the reminder hammered home, like this is what happens if you do not like look at these companies skeptically, if you take them at your word. Like me as like a 22-year-old reporting for the New York Times is just sitting there like, okay, like I do not want to be the reporter who later is pulled up in front of a jury to say like, yeah, like I asked a lot of the right questions, but like I believe them anyway. And so it's just like a beginning attitude of skepticism that I think really has since like colored a lot of my reporting.
And even for the companies that do appear to have made it, like Stripe, they can create this similar to the Holmes affair. These companies can create this like mafia-like atmosphere where anyone who dares to say anything against them, they'll have a bunch of surrogates and others come down on them like a ton of bricks. And that's in order to prevent, more of the truth from coming out. So even with a legit big success story, that it's amazing how big Stripe got without people actually understanding the dynamics of its business and the shortcomings of its business. And now I think it's a lot clearer. There's a lot of reporting that's happened in recent weeks and months, but it was incredible how much of it's funny because the former CEO of Bolt that Aaron was talking about actually made this point. He's crazy, but he made this point, and he wasn't wrong about Stripe in particular, which was a sort of random tangent in his arc, but he was correct about Stripe.
Brad, you pretty quickly went after Amir said Amazon in the beginning was a pretty, risky business to invest in, and you went, it still is. Why is that? And how do you, again, what kind of knowledge do you have, or did you pick up on that kind of shows that Amazon is such a risky business? I mean, I feel like people see Amazon as kind of this like impenetrable like temple now, with like Jeff Bezos being the richest man in the world. It's like he has all the money that he can just, throw into this business.
Right. Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at Amazon's kind of stock performance over the last 1 or 2 years, it's down significantly, it's dropped by about half. Bezos no longer runs the company. He's in fact really only tangentially involved. He's the chairman of the board. And the company for the first time in 20 years is undergoing significant layoffs. So it does feel a little bit like, an empire in decline. But to go back, and to kind of tie this to what we're talking about, 25 years ago, during the dot-com boom, a huge swell of enthusiasm. He had basically free money to invest. He bought all sorts of companies, very kind of in an undisciplined way, and then had what maybe we could even consider to be its Stripe moment in like 2000, 2001, where he kind of became the poster child for undisciplined sort of financial internet growth and he almost sort of disappeared from the scene, like hardly did any interviews, was sort of heads down for 10 years. But through it all, I think the founder has a little bit of a halo, right? A sort of magic in Silicon Valley. And they particularly like these pioneers like Jeff Bezos, now actually Emerson, the third richest person in the world, but still like described it have sort of magical touch. Excuse me. And now you look at Amazon, and he's gone, and maybe like Wall Street investors and even some customers don't feel the same way about the company. So that's another kind of factor in like identifying which of these companies is airtight, which is a total fraud. Sometimes the idea of the founder, it kind of clouds not necessarily journalists' judgment, but like investors, supporters. The founder is like sacrosanct in Silicon Valley, and there's some venture capital funds that pride themselves in a sort of blind faith in the founder. Another thing that occurred to me is, as Amir and Aaron were talking, is like we are vastly outnumbered in Silicon Valley. I wonder if you did a sort of analysis, it might be like 100 or 200 PR people to every technology journalist, and that that sort of team up of supporters that Amir was talking about. It's and so you're kind of a lone wolf in analyzing these companies, and there's such momentum behind them, behind the ideas of founders as magicians. So I don't know. It's just to say that it can feel sort of solitary right now in as a journalist in Silicon Valley, and Amazon's maybe a good example. Like even when it was its weakest, there were investors who just felt Bezos could do no wrong. And now that he's not around, there's a little bit of a reckoning.
Aaron, you mentioned earlier about getting insiders to talk to you in your previous reporting. So as like a younger journalist, and how do you build those like relationships to get these insiders to trust you and to talk to you?
I'm very smiling because he knows what I'm going to say, which is that I just sort of DM a lot of people on LinkedIn. Like I don't really have a more specific strategy than that. Every single time like I'm doing an article, I will set my like filters on LinkedIn. So it's like keyword search, whatever department or title that I'm interested in, then current company like Twitter, or like past company Bolt when I was writing about Bolt. And then I will basically just send LinkedIn connection requests. Do you get like 150 a week? And I know that because I max out like every single week. And then from there, I think what I'm always trying to do, especially when I'm reporting on a company like Twitter, where people are like very much not allowed to talk to me, very much like Elon, like will fire them, will come after them. And so I am always just trying to make it as like not stressful to talk to me as possible. So the default thing that I do is on background. So typically people will be identified as like a current employee or like a person familiar with the matter. But I will also tell people like, oh, like if you say something and then you're worried that it'll be identifying, like you can come back to me, we can figure out a way to like hedge something or not put it on the record. Like essentially I am just trying to make like this very stressful thing of like breaking your NDA, like talking to a journalist, as easy as possible, so that this is someone who like doesn't feel burned, like can become a longtime source. And like that's honestly one area where I think that it does kind of help being younger, like being female. Like I am someone who, for like a lot of like the junior employees that I'm talking to, like I'm kind of around the same age. Like I'm not someone who seems like intimidating or threatening or anything like that. It's kind of just like, oh, like me, like as a junior employee, like talking to another junior employee and having like that connection almost on that level of like, wow, like your workplace is so insane. Like, tell me more about what's happening here. So we're like trying to come out at it from like that sort of like human to human level.
Awesome. So we really want to allow a lot of time for people to ask questions from, the current journalists and editors that are here in the panel today, or in the seminar today. So we have a line with our classroom here, and then also anyone that would like to ask questions as well. So please send them over. I believe we should be able to get them in the chat. I hope so. If not, we have our classroom that is also able to ask some questions.
Well, in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, Erin, you've recently kind of shifted beats into more of a social media beat. So kind of how is that process of kind of like marking your own and being able to kind of create a new beat for yourself? What's that process like?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm still very much in the beginning of it, and it's funny because in the 9 months I've been at the information, I was hired to do venture capital and startups reporting, and then in November I pivoted to Twitter, and now I'm sort of in the process of pivoting again to Twitter and TikTok and Snap. So honestly, I am still like, the nice part is there's no like shortage of stories to cover, and so I'm trying to call like lobbyists in Washington and doing my whole LinkedIn thing to source up with people at TikTok and Snap. And so right now I'm in the process of like trying to get more sources, but it's almost like nice to know, okay, like the big story with TikTok right now is what's happening with regulation. Like the big story with Snap right now is like, how are they trying to grow and like sort of move past the idea that they're just a messaging app? Like, what are they doing with AI? Like, what are they doing with AR and VR? And so trying to take those big themes and using them as like guiding questions to like start off my reporting.
Awesome. So we have some questions in the chat. So we'll start from the top. We have Jay Campbell. So Naven, formerly Trip Actions in February, attacked our credibility without evidence in a written statement. We decided to simply run it along with links to our prior coverage so readers could come to their own conclusions. Some readers got the feeling that Naven, quote, pissed us off, and the article was the result. My question is, how do you balance simply presenting info and letting readers interpret it as they will versus specifically countering any attacks on your credibility?
I'd be curious to see that story, Jay. We just did a profile of Navan as well, and I think it was interesting because I heard from one of their biggest cheerleaders afterwards, who obviously wasn't happy about elements of it, but what you can't argue with is hard data. So the story is filled with very concrete financials and financial analysis, which just speaks for itself. So again, I don't know the nature of your story. Obviously, it's a very, very sharp elbowed CEO there who, definitely the most aggressive parts of Israeli culture appear to be there. I say that as an Israeli person, but yeah, you can't argue with data. So I think it's very, very tricky if you're relying on people who've been fired or pushed out to build a narrative around a company. It can certainly be accurate or even directionally accurate, but if you actually have like legitimate data or hard facts, it's tough to argue. I don't know if there's another way to come at that to answer that question, Jay, but I'd be really curious to see the story.
But let me also just add that, I mean, I think Jay's question is interesting, that there is a feeling, it's a couple years old now in Silicon Valley, like that the tech press is unnecessarily or unduly combative or skeptical or ideological, left-wing oriented. And you see this manifested with a lot of major tech figures and venture capitalists who have kind of gone out and tried to start their own tech publications, most of them very, very weak. And certainly like campaigning against the tech press on Twitter. So this is a form, Jay's talking about a form of what we all encounter a lot. And I think Jay, what you're talking about in terms of running Navan's statement is the right thing to do, is like just stick to your moorings and the principle of fairness and getting comment from the other side and running statements from a company, not being careful in how you conduct your kind of personal online social media presence and not being partisan on Twitter. These are the sort of fundamental things you all learn in, Alan Deutschman's J School class that are important now because the tech press and the press in general is under attack. And it's way too easy for these entrepreneurs to kind of, weaponize the distrust for the media to kind of undermine our reporting. So, sticking to the basics of journalism, trying to be fair where you can, getting comment from the other side. These things are more important than ever.
And Brad, I'm really glad you brought up this point, because one of the things is very easy for younger folks to do is to kind of use Twitter in the wrong way, in the sense that, you know, you end up looking more like an activist than a journalist. A lot of people have done this to great effect and with great success, but there's, you know, it definitely can compromise you and make you seem like you're out to kill a particular company when that's not your job and that's not what you're doing. So I would just, you know, advise extreme caution to not fall into those traps, because it's very, very easy to fall into. Twitter can be a lot of fun, maybe less fun these days, but it can be a lot of fun. And so, yeah, be careful what you say publicly. Certainly be careful what you say in email or in any other context. But yeah.
We have a question coming from the class. So how do you guys deal with the onslaught of tech PR, and kind of what's actually helpful with like dealing with that? And that's open to anybody.
I can take this. I think, like, for context, I would estimate that I probably get like 50 to 100 PR emails a day, and most of them are not that useful. So a lot of them, like, oftentimes it'll be people pitching their startup in vague relation to something that's happened in the news. Sometimes it's funding rounds, which we don't typically cover unless they're very notable or like we're able to get the scoop. The one thing that I will say though is, like, starting out, when I started at the Information, I basically took every single VC intro that I was giving. And that was a lot of calls with people at, like, oftentimes like very small venture firms who were not really involved in deals I cared about or had like portfolio companies I cared about. But the thing is that with those calls, like, venture capital is a very chatty industry. Like, all of these people talk, like, everyone's basically gossiping about like what deals are happening, like what companies should they be paying attention to, because in a lot of ways, like, it's also like a relationships, like, information type industry. And so I was able to get a lot of very good scoops from people that I never would have talked to had I been approaching every conversation with the lens of like, oh, like, I'm only trying to talk to people like Sequoia or Andreessen or anything like that. And so I would say, like, think about who in your coverage area is likely to have interesting information, even if they're not like the biggest names or like the people you see quoted in the news all the time. Because especially like starting off with a beat, like, that is a very useful way to get your feet under you. Like, there are all these people in your inbox like trying to talk to you, and like some of them will like definitely be useful.
Awesome. You mentioned rounds of funding, which kind of really gives a good line into this next question by Marty Steffens. So how do you report on rounds of funding, and what does a young journalist need to know about various forms of funding / financing?
Hey, Amir, do you want to start with this one, since you taught me how to report on rounds of funding?
Sure. I mean, Brad's probably been doing it
Sure.
longer than I have. How do you report on rounds of funding? I'd say that these days, depending on whether you're talking about an earlier stage company or a later stage company, this is a very different era in which companies are raising money. If they're in like generative AI, open AI land, then it's probably like the boom times. But otherwise, there are a lot of investor protections that are happening that are never going to be announced. They're you know, sometimes they may be disclosed, mandatory disclosures in regulatory filings, but sometimes not. Sometimes they're going to be in the charter in specific ways, sometimes not. But there are a lot of investor protections that make any headline numbers just a lot less, you know, just a lot less impressive than they may appear. There's a lot more debt being taken on. That is sometimes not disclosed either, or certainly not touted, but debt matters, and it carries, you know, burdens and risks. I think one issue with a lot of funding reporting is that it doesn't at all talk about the business and how the business is doing. So obviously companies don't necessarily like to disclose most of the time how they're doing, but it just means that you have to be really skeptical. It doesn't really matter if a company is getting funding. Their business may not be doing super well, and maybe they're able to get that funding because they told the newest investors that they would get all their money back before everyone else if something goes wrong. So it's just, you have to approach it with the same skepticism that Brad talked about earlier, like with everything else. They can be very useful ways into companies. So don't get me wrong, like you should, writing about, previously unreported deals is good. It's good in almost any situation, whether it's in a really hot area that people are trying to get on top of and it's a competitive deal, or again, in an emergency situation. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah, definitely if you're just getting information from a PR person about a funding round, chances of that being an amazing story are slim, but if you can do reporting around it, much better.
And Amir, I have another question for you from the class. So after the Lyft CEO stepped down, you stated that the most likely buyers would be self-driving taxis. And given that Uber's wasted $2.5 billion on self-driving cars, what are your thoughts on this potential acquisition?
So we were sort of playing around with this idea at the beginning of the year, just when it just seemed like this entity was not going anywhere, and Uber was eating its lunch. We were just sort of toying around with the idea of like, okay, who's actually going to take this on? For whom does this actually make sense? And if there is legitimate good technology being built around self-driving vehicles, and then yeah, you could certainly see a scenario in which you would blend the automated vehicles with human drivers for the routes that can't be automated, which is most routes now, vast majority. But yeah, that was a little bit more speculative. We really don't know. And a lot of companies, this is a public company, so a lot of other companies and private equity firms and others have already looked at this thing. Like they know what it is. They know exactly what it is. They all will have a view as to what it should be valued at and at what level makes sense to actually try to take it over. I don't think it's worth nothing. It's worth something. I think the big question is how much. And yeah, you might be referencing, a very, very short item we did. It's a little bit more on the speculative side. We really don't know. But it was not a good sign to have. The one thing that you could read into is, and I've not followed this company super closely in a while, but when they announced that they were going to have a new CEO last week, and that person was somebody sitting on the board of the company who has been running a nonprofit for 20 years and hasn't been in an operational role for 20 years, that he's there for a short period of time and to try to sell the company. There's no other explanation. That's not a serious operator who wants to get deep and dirty in this stuff. So I think, it's a bit speculative, but I think you could kind of call it like you see it.
Awesome. Next question we have is, how do you feel confident about covering tech without a technical background? This is something I definitely grapple with when I'm covering business as a non-business woman. So
yeah, I feel absolutely confident. I mean, there's a spectrum. Like, do I write code? I did in high school. Have I, lived in this community and tried to launch myself headfirst into the details of every new technology wave, and tried to be a first adopter and talk to extremely technical people. That there's a level of fluency that you get by knowing any beat. I would just probably compare it to being in a foreign bureau, and you're not from that country, but you learn it and you source up and you understand the dynamics and the people. And if anything, it's good to have people who are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, who can kind of decode the jargon and arcana of the technical world to a consumer audience, whose lives are going to be impacted, whose jobs are going to be affected by all this technology. So, no, most of us don't write code, but we do, we do live in the world. And pride myself on being sort of more sophisticated and savvy and being able to explain these things to my family at the holiday dinner table. And it does serve some journalists well who can write code and get deep into it. But I don't think you're necessarily hurt by not being extremely technical.
And every technical breakthrough does ultimately have to be translated into plain English and into business speak, because these things have to or are often turned into a commercial product, and there's very specific kind of key performance indicators that the companies are going for with respect to the technology itself and how it eventually may or may not make money. So there's always a number cruncher, at the end of this, and a board of directors that is typically very much not technical in any sense. So
we have another question from the class. So for everybody, what drove you guys to kind of get into tech journalism? Like what was the overarching thing that kind of pushed you into this side of journalism?
Erin, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, for me, it was honestly a little bit random why I initially got into tech journalism. I was applying for the New York Times Fellowship on several different desks, and the job that I ended up getting was on the tech desk. But then in terms of staying in tech journalism, the reason that I decided to apply to the information when my fellowship was ending, the reason why I wanted to keep doing like startups and venture capital, was just the idea that like startups and VC was so interesting to me because it's a whole ecosystem. There are so many different players. Like there's a lot of like power struggles in a way that's interesting, but there is also kind of the sense that you are covering something that could be the next big thing, and like all of the excitement and like responsibility that comes along with that, and getting to really interrogate like which of these companies is a scam, like the initial question, or which of these companies is building something really exciting. And so I think it's a very interesting place to be because of the outsized influence that tech companies have, but also the really powerful role that you can have as a journalist when otherwise the defining narrative would be like so PR driven.
Yeah, I'll just say, my reasons are very much the same as Erin's, although 20 years before it was, I moved to San Francisco in the late 90s. I was working for the once proud news magazine called Newsweek. And for me, it was an open lane, and I had a little bit of internet and computer fluency, and all the grizzled chain smoking old magazine writers were fearful of it. And for me, it was like this exciting thing to write about that was changing the world. And it was full of mystery and drama and crazy personalities. You had Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. And it was exciting, but like I've stayed with it because I do feel like when we look back, and when the world looks back in 50 or 100 years, presidents will come and go and conflicts will come and go, but this will be the defining change, the defining movement of our lives of the century. Like the technological, there's nothing more important or nothing changing things as profoundly, maybe climate, but technology is right up there in terms of like the biggest stories of the day. So there's no more impactful way, I think, to spend your career as a journalist than covering tech.
Agreed.
All good. Next question we have is from Sebastian Leck. In investigations, how do you make sure your reporting is accurate if you're relying on accounts from former or anonymous employees who may have their own agendas and may not have complete information themselves? Do you always ask for documentation or have a rule to corroborate each fact with 2 or more people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I've written 2 books on Amazon primarily based on the accounts of a former and some current employees speaking on background or off the record. And I mean, I think you nailed it, Sebastian. What I think about is the word triangulate. you don't take anybody necessarily at face value. I mean, depending on the source, if it's a senior executive, firsthand account in the room, you might go with a one source, attributable account. But by and large, you want to get a number of people who are in the room, corroborating the same set of facts, written documentation. The fact checking process is almost like another round of reporting, and with books and with companies, going and again, giving them the opportunity to respond, showing them what you have. At Bloomberg, we essentially operate with a philosophy of no surprises. We want companies to know what we're reporting and to have an opportunity to respond to it. So it's a process of corroborating and getting other sources and making sure that there's no one fact that you've sort of outsourced to anybody with a grudge.
Yeah, well, one trap that I feel really strongly about, that I see a lot out there in the world, is anonymous ad hominem attacks, which really take good stories and completely weaken them to the point where the company can legitimately tell anyone who is paying attention or cares, whether they're inside their company or not, that the publication has some sort of axe to grind, or is only relying on people who were kicked out for performance reasons or whatever. It's really, really important. I mean, there are a lot of there are a lot of people, like the Navan CEO, there are a lot of people in business who have very sharp elbows and are very unkind. That in and of itself is not like a gigantic scandal necessarily, but I think a lot of the anonymous sources and folks, especially who are formers at companies that are much easier to talk to, they're often directionally accurate. Some of them may be completely off base, but many of them are directionally accurate. But you can't really rely on them if you think that you're taking a chance on anything. If you have anything wrong in the story, you're just going to completely lose any credibility. So Brad's talking about a process where you're trying to discuss with the company everything that you've been told, everything that you're thinking about and wanting to incorporate. Hopefully, and some of the time they will engage with you in a productive way. Other times they won't, and they're just waiting for the moment where you publish something and they can point to it and say, haha, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, thus the whole thing is wrong. And so you have to be extremely, extremely careful. On the more ad hominem attack side, I would just say that do not quote anyone saying something super negative about anyone else unless they're willing to be quoted by name. And that's really a rule that every newsroom should adopt, period. It's for everyone's benefit. And so, yeah, just recently we did a story on Patreon, and actually we had 3 different formers quoted by name talking about the company and the CEO. And that was great because you can't really argue with that. You know who they are, you know what their deal is. We asked them, under what circumstances did you leave? We tried to hold their feet to the fire to make sure they weren't, fired for cause or weren't crazy or anything like that. But yeah, you do have to hold everyone's feet to the fire for sure. And when you're talking to somebody that's very, very critical about the company they used to work for, you just have to ask them to prove it. You don't have to say prove it, but you just have to say how can we prove it? If I'm writing a story about this, what can I really lean on? Is there any documentation out there that can prove it? I think that's something that you mentioned in your question. Otherwise, yeah, you need multiple sources, people who were there, people who saw whatever it is they're saying they saw. Erin, anything from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really think I agree with everything you and Brad were saying. I guess from the perspective of trying to work with companies and giving them, making sure that they see everything beforehand and there's no surprises. For the past few months, I've been in the interesting position that Twitter fired its comms department. The comms department currently auto responds with the poop emoji. I typically directly email Elon Musk and he's never responded to me. So I think in that situation, it's definitely a little bit stressful because yeah, I am ultimately going to be publishing stories and there's no check that I can do with the company, even to say like, hey, like we're about to do this off the record. Can you give me like a heads up or a heads down? And so with that, it's a lot of trying to see documents, trying to see before he shut down Slack, like I got a lot of mileage out of Slack screenshots, trying as much as possible to talk to multiple people directly involved with the discussions. Like I just did one story about how he wasn't paying his Amazon bill, and I was trying to like talk to like, okay, like who would directly know about this? And then ultimately, like sometimes this is less ideal, but sometimes like you end up couching things a little bit. And so I was talking to people who were directly told by others inside Twitter, not people from, and by people in Amazon. And so I ended up writing something like employees have discussed, or employees have been told that like Amazon threatened to do XYZ. And it's a little bit less strong because you don't have the direct sourcing, but like, you always want to be careful with like what you can report. And it was still like a really worthwhile story anyway.
Elon's such a great topic for journalists because he lies a lot, but he also builds real things, and people have counted him out. And there's been a lot of really good critical reporting of his companies, and it was all accurate. Like Tesla almost died. And years later, he said, oh yeah, Tesla was almost dead. At the time, he was saying everything that people are writing is false. Everything is false. Everything is false. And he has such a following that I'm sure a lot of people believed what he was saying and still believe what he's saying. But that's a really fascinating, he's just a really fascinating character, and someone where, like, as combative as he is, if you really are very careful and stick to what you know, in the long run, you will always be proven right. And you just kind of have to stick through it. But again, going back to this scam idea in the beginning of the call, like there are many elements of Elon and his businesses that are scams. And he's very much a fake it till you make it person. And all you have to do is look at everything he's ever said about Tesla autopilot software for automated driving. A lot of it's just been complete garbage, nonsense. There is something there. They have built something that works for many things. It's certainly not what he has promised, and he has been called on that again and again over the years. And we can't, again, pronounce it dead and say that it's never going to work and it's never going to fully automate the vehicle, but it's been total nonsense. And he sold people a false bill of goods, and people have paid for full self-driving software that doesn't exist, and it's probably not going to exist for a long time, if ever. So anyway, I don't know if Aaron or Brad have any thoughts about him in particular. I just think he's such a great case study, because he does wait for you to publish before he says something about what you have published. So you really better have your ducks in a row. And he may lie, like he may completely lie. And he just did that to one of our reporters not that long ago. And we went back to our sources, and our sources are like, yeah, no, he's full of crap. He also changes his mind very quickly. So you can write about something that he's doing or something that one of his companies is doing, and he could just decide as soon as he reads the piece, this is how he is, he's that impulsive, that they're going to stop doing whatever it is was reported, or they're not going to talk to this party or that party that the report said they were talking to. So you just have to kind of keep that in mind. Like, more people are going to emulate Elon Musk because it's been a very successful example.
Yeah, so probably one last question before we start wrapping things up.
Yeah, so ChatGPT was kind of mentioned offhand earlier, and we've seen so much kind of rise with AI technologies. So how do you guys kind of foresee the landscape of journalism kind of changing because of AI, like ChatGPT or deepfake technology or anything like that?
You mean, will it take our jobs? Is that the question?
Kind of, yeah.
That is the hot question nowadays.
I mean, if you're doing something that ChatGPT can automate, you shouldn't be doing it. It's as simple as that. So no, I'm not. I'm not concerned in the least. I did see. There are newsrooms. Was it at CNET? Our friend over at CNET, Brad, who's like taking on the, automated articles effort there, and I mean, I wouldn't want to touch that personally, but yeah, no, humans are going to be human. There's always going to be stories for us to write. Don't worry, Brad, Aaron.
And the good news is that the stuff that AI does very well an earnings announcement or taking a press release and turning it into an article. It's the stuff that as journalists, you kind of don't want to do anyway, right? It's the real low level, unfulfilling work. And so I do think like AI is and will make headway in that respect, but I mean, I share Amir's hopefully not over exuberant optimism that there's stuff that we do that AI won't touch. And look, it's exactly what we've been talking about on this call. It's like applying a skeptical lens, cultivating sources, getting multiple versions of the same event, trying to use your instinct to tell what's real and what's fake, assessing people and personalities. That hopefully the technology is not quite there yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with everything Brad and Amir was saying. And then just like thinking about my own job, like so much of it is the reporting element and figuring out like who to call and how to get a story. And like once I'm figured out who to call, like how I'm like on the phone with them and talking to them and convincing them to tell me something. And so like I think even if ChatGPT is able to automate a lot of the like aggregation side of it or like even the writing side of it, I think that reporting feels like a much more specialized skill that is going to stay like human only for like quite a while.
Yeah, that's a lot of the conversations I've been having with, I mean, people in all different kinds of majors where I'm like, are you afraid it's going to take your job? And they're normally like, no, because like you can't really take the human out of anything. But yeah, so one last short question I have is I've seen a lot of state reporters in my state or local reporters, posting screenshots of their Twitter verification, just before it gets taken away. So are any of you guys getting your Twitter verifications getting taken away anytime soon?
I would assume, right, in the next couple of weeks. Didn't he delay it? But yeah, no, they're going away.
Yeah, he like tweeted and deleted something saying like, oh, like I'm gonna give people like a few more weeks and then only take it away if people say they're not going to pay. But I mean, I have no idea. Like he said 90 days from like the first time he said he was going to take the check marks away was like 90 days from when Twitter Blue was first introduced, which would have been like February or something. So I think he keeps pushing this back, and at some point, honestly, he may come to the realization that like not people like the three of us, like not journalists maybe, but like he needs people like LeBron James or like Stephen King or whoever, like the actual celebrities on the site, because that's a lot of the reason why people come to Twitter in the first place. So I mean, like as stated, yes, like we're all like about to lose our check marks in 3 weeks or whatever it is now, but I sort of would not be surprised if that keeps getting pushed back or never happens at all.
Yeah,
The benefit of Twitter should be reading it, not tweeting. Like you should be able to utilize it way more and get way more value from reading people's tweets and taking advantage of the information you want to find versus using it as a distribution platform. Don't rely on it as a distribution platform.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that Instagram has now started a new verification subscription service that is more expensive than Twitter's. So that's definitely something very interesting in the new world of paying for verification. Well, yeah, just to wrap things up, we want to thank you guys so much for agreeing to be a part of this panel and bringing all of you guys' experience, years of experience combined. So thank you so much. And then we obviously have to ask the last golden journalism question of, is there anything else you would like to add?
We're hiring. I don't know.
Oh.
If you want to move to San Francisco, if you're not already there, come talk to us. Right, Brad?
No, it's been great having this discussion, and Aaron and Amir, it's great seeing you guys, and thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you guys again. Yeah, so I'm Jacob.
I'm Emerson Drews, and thank you so much for everyone for attending, and have a good day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.